If you're the Prime Minister, you wake up in the morning and you say, what am I going to do? And if you're the leader of the opposition, you wake up and say, what am I going to say? Now, Kemi Badenoch doesn't like saying. She doesn't like going on.
She likes the first line.
Yeah,
she loves the first line.
Yeah, but she doesn't do many BBC interviews. She doesn't do ITV. She doesn't like media.
She doesn't. John Sopel.
Sorry? Yeah,
she turned you down.
Yeah, exactly. Too many times.
I think there is a lesson from what Trump is doing and how he's approached the media. He might not do the established media as much as he used to, but he's also omnipresent on social, on online. Something else that Kemi Badenoch doesn't do. Some of the government's problems is they're still doing a mid-2000s comms playbook, which is basically do the Today programme, you do the morning round and hope the message kicks.
Look, if that's right, then you don't need to do an interview ever again. You just need to tweet your stuff out.
Before you watch today's episode, we want to remind you that tickets are on sale for the newsagent's live shows with HSBC UK. We're kicking off our tour at the Birmingham Symphony Hall on February the 17th. Then we're off to the Bridgewater Hall in Manchester on February the 24th. And finally, the Usher Hall in Edinburgh on March the 11th. Head over to Global Player to get your tickets for any of these dates, and the link will be in the description below. We are so excited to see all of you there.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservative government established the Ukraine Family Scheme, and in total, over 200,000 Ukrainians, mostly women, children and the elderly, have found sanctuary in the UK from Putin's war. However, a family of 6 from Gaza have applied to live in Britain using this scheme, and a judge has now ruled in their favour. This is not what the scheme was designed to do. This decision is completely wrong. It cannot be allowed to stand. Is the government planning to appeal on any points of law? And if so, which ones?
Minister. Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. I do not agree with the decision. She's right. It's the wrong decision. She hasn't quite done her homework because the decision in question was taken under the last government according to the legal framework of the last government.
It's the second week running where Kemi Badenoch hasn't done her homework. She's having a few problems landing a blow at Prime Minister's questions. So it seems she's developing a new communication strategy.
She's considering taking a leaf out of Donald Trump's playbook, finding a sphere of right-wing podcasts to get her message out. But can that work here? Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's John.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis. And yes, Kemi Badenoch has given an interview to a podcast which maybe you've heard of, maybe you haven't, called Trigonometry. It's a popular YouTube podcast hosted by a couple of comedians. They describe the show as an open, fact-based discussion of important and controversial issues, right up Kemi Badenoch's street. And this has been written up because Badenoch, the background to this is, she's now been Tory leader for over 100 days. There are a lot of pretty unhappy Conservative MPs. They don't think she's landing any blows at PMQs. They're not sure what the strategy is. Lots of murmurings. It's a tough job, but they don't feel she's necessarily prosecuting it that well. And there is another worry about her, which is it's widely known she does not like doing the media, which is a little bit of a problem if you're leader of the opposition, where basically anywhere between like half and 80% of what you do is trying to court and trying to talk to the media in order to get a hearing, because it is difficult to do so. But she's got this idea she's putting forward. She thinks she can emulate what Trump did in the election, which is speak to new media, particularly a kind of a right-wing podcast ecosystem, in order to get her message out there. And I think it's really interesting to consider actually whether that is possible in this country, because when you consider the differences between the US and UK media landscape, it's kind of interesting to think about our media ecosystems still are quite different.
It's interesting that the Conservatives are now 5 points or so consistently behind reform, and that is presenting a much bigger problem for the Conservatives now than for Labour, not just because Labour's kind of in power and holds the levers of government, but because the messages between the Conservatives and reform are much, much more similar. And what I think has happened is that GB News has become this really helpful platform for reform. It's essentially, been nicknamed Farage TV. So you've got the leader of a party, the leader of a fast-growing party now, who essentially has not only his own TV programme, but essentially has become the face of the actual channel. And I guess the question for Kemi Badenoch is, does she try and enter the GB news sphere? You know, you see a lot of people, a lot of politicians of all stripes going on there to try and speak directly to their constituents in a way, you know, that they might not get on the BBC or in other places. But Kemi may be feeling that GB News has now not a Tory-leaning place at all. If it's just becoming the face of Farage, is she ever feeling that she's going to get a fair ride there? And is that going to be the place like Rishi Sunak? Rishi Sunak essentially made GB News his own. I don't think she has done that or would be able to do that.
I think what's interesting is, again, the difference between the US and the UK. And it's kind of, I don't want to, in this any way to be, you know, us talking about our podcast, you know, I mean, Kemi Badenoch, you're welcome on any time if you... Always. But, you know, in America, the biggest podcasts are normally those that are from a particular viewpoint. And you look at sort of Joe Rogan, or you look at Steve Bannon's podcast, or, you know, Alex Jones, the far-right conspiracy theorist. They're big and they make a lot of money and they are kind of earning their hosts huge sums of money. It's not like that here. I still think we're in a slightly more Ofcom world in the UK where media sees itself as having to be sort of impartial and not on the one hand on the other, but you subject all viewpoints to scrutiny. Whereas in the US, it's been for decades now, much more partial. And if we have a Wild West in terms of newspapers with a lot of right-wing newspapers and, you know, the Daily Mirror and the Guardian a bit to the left, in the US, you have an ecosystem of broadcasters, of Fox, of One American News Network, of Newsmax that are very much to the right, and you've got MSNBC that's a bit to the left, and you've got a much more diversified ecosystem, which you don't have here. And I don't know what the big right-wing podcasts are that would say compete with Joe Rogan or, you know, Steve Bannon, The War Room.
I think this is a really interesting way of thinking about Badenoch's media strategy, because which so far has been to do quite few interviews and to, it looks like, going to be focusing on these sorts of alternative outlets. I mean, it's an interesting strategy. And in the sort of podcast that she's done, she's also not only saying she wants to emulate the Trump strategy, but has been heaping sort of praise on Trump himself, on Musk, on Doge, kind of overlooking all of the kind of big questions of corruption and all of this sort of accountability questions which are going on in Washington right now. But I think it is interesting to consider the differences, because I think the reason that sort of strategy won't work, or at least it won't work yet in Britain, is that, and why you still can't bypass the media in the way that Trump did completely during the election, is because in the US, the media has almost lost completely, as in the sort of quote-unquote legacy media, it's almost lost its ability to dictate the conversation completely. Like now, actually, the thing that matters far more is like, what has Elon tweeted? That dictates the conversation, right? The traditional newspapers, I mean, it was always less whole to begin with than it was in the UK. But the UK, it still feels to me that the newspapers and to some extent the broadcasters on a daily basis are still performing that traditional kind of aggregating, mediating function on the day-to-day bit of the political conversation in a way that has just been completely lost in the US. And then on top of that as well, as you say, John, we just don't have yet, maybe it will emerge in the next 3 to 4 years, but right now a lot of the sort of podcasting space has not emerged that kind of right-wing ecosystem that exists in the United States at the moment. So it's hard to see how it would function.
I also think it comes down to personality, because when you look at the kind of podcast that you're talking about in the US, the Joe Rogans, they're not half-hour accountabilities. They're not 10 minutes on the Today programme. They're 3-hour, often, long, rambling chats. Trump is really good at that stuff because he can do that, quite frankly, on his own. You know, He does it on the golf course. He does it in press conferences. He does it, you know, at rallies. He just literally can talk quite happily. I mean, kind of talk about complete shit quite often, whether it's sharks or windmills or electrocution or golfers' penises or whatever, for 3 hours at a time. And he doesn't feel under the cosh. He doesn't feel like he's being held accountable. Now, my sense is, and maybe it could work, I don't know, but my sense is Kemi Badenoch would have to feel really comfortable with a host before she went on and said, oh, let's just, you know, shoot the breeze, you know,
kick off your shoes.
Kick off your shoes. What are we going to do? I mean, remember that Kamala Harris tried to, I think she did it twice. She did it on Call Her Daddy, which is kind of like the sex show where you're meant to be intimate and you talk about all the stuff that, you know, sort of goes on under the covers or whatever. She did it with Charlemagne, right, who was meant to be the sort of nearest she got. She didn't do it with Rogan. She said, oh, it's a clash of
schedules.
A clash of schedules, exactly, because he was in Texas. But I think it's much more that actually you have to be prepared for all kinds of things if you're going to sit there and do 3 hours. Now, of course, like, she doesn't have to do Joe Rogan, right? In fact, I don't think Joe Rogan and Kemi are particularly aligned. But what happens if you do somebody who takes you off into some wacko conspiracy, right? Do you shout it down? Do you say, oh no, I belong in the realms of the credible? Do you go with it?
She's very conspiratorial in her style, so she'd probably quite fit in.
She's not Liz Truss. I mean, Liz Truss is a real addict of that kind of stuff. She can mention the deep state 6 times in one speech, right? She loves a bit of deep state.
Quite a bit of that in Kemi, though, as well.
Really?
Yeah. But I think the difference is...
Is that how you get Tory voters back? I'm not sure that's how you get Tory voters back.
I just really struck. I remember when Blair was opposition leader, and he said the difference between, you know, being prime minister and being leader of the opposition. If you're the prime minister, you wake up in the morning and you say, "What am I going to do?" And if you're the leader of the opposition, you wake up and say, "What am I going to say?" Now, Kemi Badenoch doesn't like saying. She doesn't like going on.
She likes the first line.
Yeah,
she loves the first line.
Yeah, but she doesn't want to go on. You know, she doesn't do many BBC interviews. She doesn't do ITV. She doesn't.
She
doesn't like the
turned
media.
you
She
down,
doesn't.
John Sopel.
Sorry.
She turned you down.
Yeah, exactly. Too many times. And you go to and meet her at parties and you say, "Hey, I'd love to come."
Oh, she has turned him down.
Yeah. Oh, for God's sake!
How could you turn down John Sopel?
Honestly, at the spectator party.
Oh, let it go, John.
No, and you think,
Grow up.
but she just doesn't want to do interviews. She hates the idea of sitting down with a journalist. It's her idea of absolute purgatory and hell. And I'm not sure that even if the podcast is a bit more, you know, sympathetic to her, whether she would enjoy that. I think she just doesn't like communicating.
So is there a market? That's the other question. Do we have the markets, or could we create? Will we create a market for a long form, like sort of hard right or conspiracy right podcast?
What, us?
No,
Let's give it a go.
Yeah,
why not?
Conspiracy
The money's
agents.
there.
Yeah,
The
fine.
news agents go right.
Yeah, but I mean, as a country, do you think we'd be up for it? Listeners.
Well, I think you've seen what's happened with GB News, which has come and has been an insurgent and has been a disruptor and has kind of upset the apple cart. You know, I think that Sky News finds itself...
But that's kind of like grumbling about... That's like grumbling in the pub. Isn't this shit? Isn't Britain shit? Hasn't all that gone to the
different.
dogs?
Yeah,
it's a very
the tone's
different tone.
But
yeah.
I think, I mean, I'm surprised Farage hasn't started one. I think there probably is enough for him. I'm surprised he hasn't started one. But I still think, I mean, this is where I think the Badenoch thing kind of falls down. And I think there are lessons for Starmer as well, which is she's trying to do the Trump playbook, and she's hoping she can ignore the media. But we have a very good case or a very good control for when governments or oppositions try and ignore the media. Even the government can't ignore the established media in Britain still. I would say the established media, the legacy media, is still far more powerful than it is in the US. Look what happened with Starmer over the summer. Starmer, partly because Sue Gray was there, they weren't tending to the grid of government announcements. There was a void. What happened? They ended up getting distracted by ephemera, largely, about suits and about the cost of things and expense and all these sort of things, because the media, the established media this time, were looking for a narrative and looking for something to say and do. Now, that would be much harder to prosecute in the US. Always would have been, because the UK media has always been more concentrated and has acted more of a pack kind of collectively. But now, you know, New York Times can say something, the Washington Post can do something, NBC can do something. Trump won't care. He'll just be pissing in the wind. No one will care at all. And I think that in a way, both Starmer and Badenoch are like learning the wrong lessons from Trump. I think there is a lesson from what Trump is doing and how he's approached the media, but neither are learning. What Trump is doing is he's everywhere, right? He does do everything, and he might not do the established media as much as he used to, but he's also omnipresent on social and online, something else that Kemi Badenoch doesn't do. And I'm really struck. I think it affects government communications as well. I'm amazed the number of times you talk to, I mean, I do quite a lot. You talk to sort of Labour people and you say, oh, can we have an interview for this? Can we get X on this? And they say, oh no, the grid is that, you know, Minister X is doing...
So you've been turned down as well.
I know, I've been turned down. We've all been turned. It might be just us. But the minister, you know, is doing something in the morning. That is such a 90s or 2000s way of doing government
ancient.
communication. Because it just doesn't hold. Even an interview with a PM will struggle to hold. The news cycle is just so much less now. You have to do, I think, forget the grid. I think basically
everything,
just say
everywhere,
yes
all the time.
to everything. That is the lesson from Trump.
I think the difference is that both party leaders operate inside the structure of a party. And that is so different that Kemi Badenoch, if she gets removed for doing things wrong, will be by her own colleagues, will be by her own MPs. It'll be by the person who, if you like, shapes the party and the leader within it. And it is the same, I think, still for the Prime Minister to some extent. You know, he is there at the top of his cabinet. Trump has never been part of a party. He's never played those rules. And Biden, similarly, you know, could not be removed because there was nobody to tell him to go. I think that structure is very different here.
Yeah, it does make a difference. But I think that in terms of there are still parallels and there are still ways in which it does work the same, because I think that, you know, we are now in the primary feature of modern politics and modern media, which is basically the same thing now, is that everything is fragmented and fragmenting. And it's happened to a greater extent in the US, but we are catching up. And that means that instead of just having, you know, a few newspapers to deal with, a few news channels to deal with, a few broadcasters to deal with, you have this like sort of media landscape which is fractured and shattered into so many different pieces. And we are in an attention-based political environment. You know, the big battle is for attention. It is for eyeballs. It is for screens. It is for moments on phones. People are getting their news in that way, in that highly fragmented way. And in that circumstances and that environment, you just have to be in as many places as possible. And I think some of the government's problems, its communications problems in getting its message out there, is they're still doing a mid-2000s comms playbook, which is basically do the Today programme, you do the morning round and hope the message kicks.
Look, if that's right, then you don't need to do an interview ever again. You just need to tweet your stuff out. But you just need to get yourself out because you don't actually need to be part of an interview.
But hang on, look, let's just play a clip from Joe Rogan now. He's talking about Elon Musk. This is this week, and I would argue that in Trump land and among the Republican base, this has far more impact than anything that would ever appear in the New York Times, the Washington Post, on NBC, on ABC or CBS.
This other thing about Elon. Elon's going to steal everybody's money. He has $400 billion. I'm telling you, he's not going to steal your money. I'm telling you, that's not what he's doing. What he's doing is he's a super genius that's been with, okay? And when you've been with by these nitwits that hide behind three-letter agencies, and you're dealing with one of the smartest people alive, and he helps Donald Trump get into office, and he goes, I want to find out what kind of corruption is really around. Well, you up. You up and picked the wrong psychopath on the spectrum, because he's gonna hunt you down.
That is Joe Rogan on Elon Musk being very, very supportive. It makes me feel that actually whatever bad language that Maitlis and I may use occasionally, God, we've got a long way to go before we're Joe Rogan.
In so many ways.
In so many ways, yeah. Look, I think that, you know, the podcast land in America, that space is entirely different from what we've got in the UK, because I still think, as you say, Lewis, we're back in a kind of 1990s, 2000 grid era where politicians still think the best thing they can do is just worry about what's in the Daily Mail or what's on the Guardian or what's on, you know, the BBC.
I mean, I do think that the government's, which matters more than Badenoch, I think the government's approach to communications, not just in that way, but also on social, they are weirdly not particularly plugged into some of these changes. And I'm surprised at the extent to which they didn't look at what happened with Biden, because that is the other control. Biden compared to Trump, Biden was the guy who basically didn't communicate very much, had a more traditional approach to everything, partly because he could do no other, because he became increasingly incapable of doing anything else. And we saw what happened when they had an opponent who flooded the zone, who had a great social media game, who did everything. That is Farage. I mean, Farage is very good on social, he's very good on TikTok. He sort of gets that, he's very attuned to what Trump has done. And I'm amazed the extent to which this is a lack of urgency from the government about getting on to new media and also doing and improving their social game, which right now is kind of nowhere.
In a moment, we will be back with an astonishing report that's been on ITV News about the organisation of a far-right grouping, which is right on the edge of what is extremism and what is terrorism. On ITV tonight, on the news, you're going to see an extraordinary report of a group of neo-fascists, it's hard to describe them as anything else, gathering, training, learning. And it's really different from anything we've seen before. Here's a little excerpt from Rohit Kacharu's report.
What looks at first like a keep fit class is in fact Britain's leading far-right force, training in plain sight. You're about to see many months condensed into minutes. Since the summer riots, we've been watching the group's growth and hearing its descent towards violent, racist rhetoric.
I don't think that people think they're black. I don't like their culture. I don't like the way they behave. I don't like the way they act. It's not their skin colour, it's them.
As the seasons changed, so did the language.
Down, guys. White power.
So did their intentions.
Got about a grand's worth of throwing some axes on the way, and I've got a bunch of bows as well.
More than 100 hours of undercover footage helped to tell the story of a group preparing for violence.
It's very clear the racism, the white supremacy, the anti-Semitism is...
It is a white supremacist group masquerading as a fitness club, and it has been secretly working to build a far-right militia, holding training sessions in plain sight. And the voice you heard there was Rohit Kacharu, ITV's global security editor, who's with us now. And congrats, Rohit, on this piece. How did you find them?
Well, I mean, there are many answers to that question, because the people we first saw early in the autumn, when we first started engaging with this organisation, were not the people we saw at the end of it. We saw evolution in the language, in the intentions of this group. And look, there's a wide range of people, a wide range of views. There are people who are probably more into the fitness and the fraternity of this organisation. But clearly within them, there are more than one extremist with a history of violence. And that language they felt more comfortable as time went on. So by Christmas, they were speaking quite openly about the use of weapons, but then caveating their comments with, well, you know, like, we don't break the law, we stay this side of the law. And that is part of what's so interesting about this group. And there's something new there, you know, that is different to some extremist groups, but there's something very old because, you know, as the footage was coming in, some of it really reminded me of figures and groups like Anjem Choudhury. You know, people who managed to outrun the law for 20 years because they stayed just one step on this side of it.
A completely different
Absolutely.
Side of the
Yeah, I mean, these are ideological enemies.
Yeah.
And yet in terms of ambition and structure, perhaps they have more in common than either side would like to admit.
And the other thing that struck me, I mean, look, you know, you heard all sorts of unpleasant language being used in your report, was the kind of discipline and order. You know, don't use this telephone, communicate via this because that's a safer method. And also how much you can bench press and how many press ups you can do in a minute as well. Yeah. If you're going to be allowed into this group, because you've got to be physically really fit.
Yeah. You know, this wasn't a hobby. You know, they were clearly, you know, and this, by the way, is a view that is echoed by Neil Basu, who's looked at extracts from our recordings, a former head of counter-terrorism policing. You know, the guy who was in charge of counter-terrorism policing when National Action, the first far-right group to be outlawed, was prescribed. And you see real levels of organisation and preparation for a race war. At one moment, there's one, regular member of this group who says they're going to take power. So this is about more than keep fit. This is about more than press ups and, you know, trying to sort of, you know, increase your heart rate, once every 2 weeks. This is about planning for a moment they see as inevitable.
A moment they see as inevitable as what? As a race war?
Yeah, absolutely. They see this conflict between the races as being an inevitable moment in this sort of societal evolution that they're part of. We had a team at ITV News who've been watching and monitoring this. And I think the starting point of this was when my colleague really noticed during the summer riots, we'd been looking at a lot of the Telegram conversations where people were trying to provoke rioting. And this group kept coming up, Active Club England. It kept coming up, and they kept inviting people, trying to provoke violence, but also trying to invite people to join. And so we did. Our undercover journalist was in there for many months, who attended a dozen meetings, some of them in Vauxhall, just a few steps, as it so happens, from the headquarters of MI6. And actually, at one point, they pose for a photograph there. It's a trophy. But there are meetings elsewhere, and in the West Midlands and the northeast of England, this group is growing, and they've tapped into something new here. And we've seen an example of this in the United States, where Active Club is more established and it's a bigger organisation. We've seen it in France, in Scandinavia, parts of Europe too. They are tapping not only into this sort of white supremacy, anti-Semitism, but on top of that, they've managed to tap into this sort of hypermasculinity space.
Young?
Yeah, primarily young. In fact, they say in one exchange that they've had 16-year-old applicants, and they say that what amounts to a mission statement. They say at one point on Telegram that their aim is to appear edgy, to appear different, and to attract young people.
So I don't know whether you know the answer to this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Which is, look, you managed to get someone in there. Do you think the security services also had someone in there?
Who knows? I mean, who knows? This is not a prescribed group. This is not a banned group. This is not a terrorist organisation. But clearly,
do you think it should be?
Well, I mean, there's a strict definition with terrorism, and from what we've witnessed, this is a group that is trying very hard to stay this side of the line. But we saw with National Action, the first banned far-right group, that they did stay on the extremism versus terrorism side of the line for a while, until one comment, until the glorification of the killing of the MP Joe Cox. And that is what allowed government officials to change the law, to ensure that this group was banned, so their future meetings were suddenly, that at the weekend had been legal, the following week were suddenly illegal. And, we can't tell what action, what observations the police, the security services are making, but clearly that is the sort of thing that the government will be watching for.
Well, let's listen now to the moment where you confront one of the members of this group.
Got a question, Glenn. Sorry, Jay. What's your problem with black people?
He answers with a smile.
Glenn, when's the next training session?
Moments later, he posts in the private Telegram forum.
Basically, there's a snitch in this group chat. How the would ITV know my name Glenn, and where the find me?
So that was Glenn posting a voice message on the group chat saying, we've got a snitch.
Was he right? Was your reporter inside that group chat then?
We were watching the group chat.
Yeah.
We were watching the group chat. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, he's correct. He's correct.
Can you explain this to us? Why are you broadcasting tonight? Why did you stop the investigation? You could have carried on, and I'm sure there's always a judgment to be made, editorial judgment to be made about how far you go.
Yeah, and there are judgments every day, every week. And, we felt that we had witnessed an evolution that was worth telling our viewers about. And, perhaps we could have continued. Perhaps we could have broadcast this piece earlier. I mean, there's so much that goes into those decisions. But the conclusion we made to was that this should be the moment. We had seen this group, the seasons change. Events happen. A change of government in the United States. Events happening all over the world. And our intention was never to keep following this forever, but we feel that we have observed a language, intention serious enough to bring to our viewers, and we decided that this was the right moment to do it.
And what happens now? I mean, you don't want MI5 to arrest them, do you? They know now that you've reported on them. Do they just go underground? Do they change the name? Do they row back on some? I don't know.
Well, and similarly, that's in a way that's not our
Your
problem as well. I mean, they have their job to do. We have a very separate job to do. What's clear is in the moments after we approached Jay, known as Glenn, that Telegram group disbanded, and that was the main form of communication. What we can't say is what sort of bilateral communications were happening between these members, and I'm sure they were, because part of their ideology is not simply about white supremacy or anti-Semitism. It's also about fraternity. It's about becoming friends, to give this sort of safe space to encourage this ideology so I'm sure people are communicating individually. I mean, I can't say what is happening beyond this moment, but they have been meeting regularly for the past few months, and clearly members were spooked, and so it's not clear what will happen next.
So what's your judgment? Is this just a bunch of fantasists who become mates through ideas of hypermasculinity, or are they a threat to national security?
It's certainly this is a group with more than 100 members now, and as we've observed, not everyone speaks the same. People have different views. What's quite interesting about this organisation is it's a sort of federal, decentralised network. So there are chapters around the UK, 8 chapters around the UK now, chapters in the US, in Europe, who might have different views on, for example, the Israel-Gaza conflict or the election of Donald Trump. They attempt to empower their members by letting them take decisions locally under this sort of banner of white supremacy. And clearly, from everything that is written down, they are not calling for violence. And that's a slight, that's a very clear definition that they share. They say they're preparing for violence, but not calling for it. And, it's up to the authorities to assess whether their actions, their language, and whatever else they might know about this group crosses the line. I mean, for us, all we're trying to do is put out there what's already happening, and the authorities and our viewers and your listeners can make their own minds up.
Before we go, we have reported on the newsagents about the vast number of condoms, millions of them, that were being sent to Hamas in Gaza. It turns out not to be true. This is Elon Musk in the White House yesterday with Donald Trump.
Musk, you said on X that an example of the fraud that you have cited was $50 million of condoms was sent to Gaza. But after fact-check this, it apparently Gaza in Mozambique, and the program was to protect them against HIV. So can you correct the statements? It wasn't sent to Hamas, actually. It was sent to Mozambique, which makes sense why condoms was sent there.
Yeah.
And how can we make sure that all the statements that you said were correct, so we can trust what you say?
Well, first of all, some of the things that I say will be incorrect and should be corrected. So nobody's going to bat 1,000. I mean,
that is Elon Musk giving a press conference in the Oval Office with his toddler on his shoulders as he speaks, admitting that, they're going to get things wrong, but, hey, whatever, we're going to get things wrong. You can hear more from that press conference, and indeed of what's happening to the bribery laws now under Trump in America, on the Newsagents USA over on that feed.
Literally a toddler in the Oval Office. Goodbye. Bye.
Bye for now.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.